Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of the Director's Distinguished Lecture Series. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Jamie Metzl to Livermore and to thank... I think this may be the first time we had a pre-installed fan base for a speaker. I thank him for coming here today to share his thoughts on the future of genetic engineering. He's a technology futurist and geopolitical expert, a novelist, entrepreneur, media commentator, and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. In February 2019, he was appointed to the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on developing global standards for the governance and oversight of human genome editing. Jamie previously served in the U.S. National Security Council, State Department, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and as a human rights officer for the UN in Cambodia. He's a former partner of a New York-based global investment firm, serves on the advisory council to Walmart's Future of Retail Policy Lab, is a former faculty for Singularity University's Exponential Medicine Conference, and was chief strategy officer for a biotechnology company. Jamie has served as an election monitor in Afghanistan and in the Philippines, advised the government of North Korea on the establishment of special economic zones, and is the honorary ambassador to North America of the Korean Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. Jamie appears regularly on national and international media discussing Asian economic and political issues, and his syndicated columns and other writing on Asian affairs, genetics, virtual reality, and other topics are featured regularly in publications around the world. He's the author of A History of the Cambodian Genocide, the historical novel The Depths of the Sea, and the genetic thrillers Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata. His nonfiction book, Hacking Darwin, Genetic Revolution and the Future of Humanity, which was released in April of 2019 and will be the focus of today's talk, explores what the genetics revolution means for you, your family, the country, and the world. He is also the subject of a Joe Rogan podcast, which has enough notoriety to have been downloaded over 7 million times. We're very, very happy and grateful that he's been able to take the time to talk to us today. Please join me in welcoming Jamie Metzl.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. It's really just a tremendous honor for me here, to be here with you at Lawrence Livermore. I mean, first, as an American, the work that you guys are doing here to help our country and the world is just so spectacular. And I was just talking to Bill and Anantha about this. It's like this double-edged sword. On one hand, we should be shouting from the mountaintops about all the incredible work that's happening here. On the other hand, there's a little bit of madness you may have noticed coming out of Washington, and being under the radar is actually a decent place to be. So whether everybody knows or a few people know, we know, people know, and you know that the work that you guys are doing is safeguarding our country and our world, and really nothing could be more important. So thank you so much, and that's why it's really just an honor and a great pleasure for me to be here. And I have a connection to Lawrence Livermore because Eric Schwegler, are you here somewhere? Eric and I are from Kansas City. We went to the same high school. I know his whole family and his sisters. So if you want to get some dirt on Eric, to use against him if you're in any kind of bureaucratic tiff with him, please just approach me afterwards, and I'll just give you all the secrets. And it's such an incredible moment. I mean, the reason why I think your work is I think maybe the most important type of work that anybody is doing in the world, and this is one of the most important places where that work is happening, is that we are part of this just fundamental shift in what it means to be a human being on planet Earth. I mean, that's this moment, and we have these revolutionary technologies that are exponential, that are advancing so rapidly, that are creating just new realities around us and new realities within us. And it's so profound that it's almost hard for all of us to get our minds around the magnitude of the change that's happening and what is coming. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And one of them is just the very structure of our brains, that we have brains that are designed to be very pragmatic thinking. Because if you're in the savannah and you're there and you're looking up and you see a bird and you think, wow, birds can fly, maybe someday humans can fly. How might we fly? Maybe we're going to need to think differently about aerodynamics and space and time and technology. And you're kind of looking up, and your friends and colleagues who have a little more practical brains, who are not dreaming about the exponential future, those are the guys who say, I think I heard a rustling in the grass over there. I'm going to run that way. So those guys are long gone, and you're not your ancestor. Dead people's ancestors were up there saying, like, I wonder if we're going to have flying machines. And that's kind of the last thought as the saber-toothed tiger pounces on you. So we have these very practical brains. And then with our practical brains, we think about change based on our experience of change. I mean, this is 2019. Everybody kind of knows what a 10-year unit of change is. It's 2019 minus 10 years. So you know what life was like in 2009. You know what life is like today. Just internally, we think, all right, that's a 10-year unit of change. And so between 2019 and 2029, based on this practical thinking, based on the structure of our brains, well, the world is going to be 1x. 1x from 2009 to 2019, plus 1x from 2019 to 2029. But you all know that that's not true because we are all on these exponential J-curves, especially with any technology that even touches digitization. And so that's the whole idea of Moore's Law. And I don't need to explain Moore's Law to you, but we've all internalized Moore's Law. And these laws like it, we've internalized it so much that we have an absolute expectation that our technology is variable and always changing. I mean, just imagine hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, you didn't have that expectation. It's like, this is a plow. This plow is like my parents' plow. My kids will someday inherit this plow. And that was a plow. And once in a while, there'd be a little small change, and that change would slowly diffuse. And we are, this in our world, it's just very, very different because this technology is on a J-curve. And we've internalized that for our information technology. And on an intuitive sense, not on an intellectual sense, on an intuitive sense, we haven't internalized that for our biology. We just feel, well, I'm a Homo sapien, my parents, my grandparents, ... were Homo sapiens. My kids, my grandkids, I am anticipating, will be Homo sapiens. And we kind of feel like our biology is fixed. Even when we imagine sci-fi in the future, it's like we have, for some logical casting reasons, but we have humans like us, and they're flying around in the cool spaceships, and they have this really awesome tech, but they are kind of like us because we feel that our biology is fixed in a certain way. But why do we feel that? It doesn't make any sense because we used to be single-cell organisms 3.8 billion years ago, and we have morphed continually into this. And so this, I mean, I love being human, but if you had a software program for your work that was as buggy as human biology, you would say, you know, it's not really working. Like, we need to improve the software. And we experience those bugs in our lives. And sometimes we call them genetic diseases. Other times we just call them fate. And it's really, and this idea of fate, this idea that biology works in this way, and we can try to push at the edges, but ultimately it's fate. You know, some young child died of a terrible genetic disease that was incurable. It's a terrible fate. A 90-year-old grandmother or grandfather gets Alzheimer's or dementia, and we throw away, unfortunately, 90 years of development and knowledge and wisdom. It's fate. That's how biology works. We feel. But why do we feel that? The whole history of our species has been fighting against nature. I always meet with people and with groups, and when I say, like, I won't use the foul language I use in private, but you can fill in the blanks. F blank blank K nature. And that doesn't mean I think we should bulldoze forests, but it means that the history of our species has been our use of technology to go to war with nature. We've gone too far in going to war with nature. But when we totally cohabited with nature, like our ancestors who were just one animal among many animals, it sucked. Like, if someone says, hey, you can go back to that old life that our ancestors used to live, and you get to live in a cave, and when you go out hiking, because everyone likes to go hiking in nature, you're going to have predators who are trying to eat you, and the story of your life is going to be scrounging for calories in inhospitable environments, and then there's a drought, and almost everybody you know is going to die because you don't have access to water, and you have to look around for a water hole, and when you get there, you have to fight off all the other animals. Like, you like nature? How about that? And nobody would sign up for that. So the history of our species is, in some ways, our cohabitation with nature, and that's good. And in some ways, it's our war with nature. That's what agriculture is. Like, how could we support 7+ billion humans, going up to 10 or 11, if we didn't have agriculture, if we didn't have health care? I mean, we are here in a building. This building was built with technology. And so when I talk about these changes in technology, and you all know this, it's not that we need to cohabitate perfectly with nature. We can't change nature. We must change nature. The entire history of our species is we're here because we changed nature. But the question is, what's the right relationship with the natural world? And how do we recognize that we are part of an ecosystem and that our health on every level, whether it's in terms of our own personal biology, where about 20% of our weight are these cells, the microbiome, that aren't even technically us, they're symbionts, or just this same model in the ecosystem of our entire planet. That you could say, well, I'm going to go to war with my own microbiome, but you're going to die probably if you do it. And you could say, I'm going to go to war with nature, but because we exist within the context of this ecosystem around us, harming that world is harming us. And so the question for us is, what's the right balance? And I connect that to this observation about where we are in this moment, because as you all know, in the 1950s, when Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin and others identified the double helix structure of DNA, what they were doing is identifying there's a book of life organized in the double helix. And then with the culmination of the Human Genome Project in 2003, we began our process of reading the human genome. And now at the beginning of the age of human genome editing, and everybody is familiar with CRISPR, And CRISPR is not the last word in precision gene editing. It is very, very much the first word. So we are moving towards greater and greater levels of precision in genome editing. We are at the beginning of this age where we are going to read, write, and hack all of biology, including our own. And that's going to have just deep and profound and fundamental implications for every aspect of our lives. And there are three areas where it's going to hit us most immediately, and already is. The first is in the context of our healthcare. When we talk about genetics, most people immediately think, all right, genetics, healthcare. And that's logical, because most of our interaction with genetics is in the context of our healthcare. And we are in this process of transitioning from our world of generalized healthcare based on population averages. And so by generalized healthcare, it means that when you go to your doctor for treatment for one thing or another, you are treated based on the fact that you are a human being. And that's actually so much better than everything that's existed before. And so if you have a headache, for example, maybe your doctor says, take a Tylenol. If you're 88% of people in the United States who have cancer, you say, oh, it's a liver cancer. Here's a treatment for liver cancer. And so a human with liver cancer would have this kind of treatment. But we are moving toward a world of personalized or precision medicine based on each person's individual biology. So rather than saying we're going to give you this generalized treatment that all humans showing your symptoms would get, we're going to want to know more about who you are so that we can tailor the treatment to your individual biology. And that's going to allow us to say, well, we're not just giving you a generalized drug, we're giving you a drug that we know is far more likely to work on a person with a biology like yours. So it significantly increases the chances of success. And there are a lot of delivery mechanisms, a lot of ways of thinking about this. And whether it's genetic pharmacology, whether it's gene therapy, whether it's creating organelles, these little models of our own cellular structures. So let's say you have a heart condition, you can generate your heart cells and then try different combinations of drugs to see which one is likely to work on these cells outside of your body, your cells outside of your body, before making decisions about how to treat you inside of your body. So when you go to see your doctor is going to need to know who you are on a biological level. And so the way that they are going to do that is by gathering as much information as possible. So certainly your health records, your family records, your life records, your biometric information, your metabolomics, all these other things are going to be critically important. But the foundation of personalized/precision medicine is going to be your sequenced genome. And that's why we are going to see in the very near future having your genome sequenced just part of being born in any part of the world where you're going to access modern healthcare. Right now, when a baby is born, they get a little heel prick blood test, and it's used to test for a relatively small but important number of conditions. But we are very quickly moving into a world where every newborn, and sometimes even pre-newborns, are going to have their whole genome sequenced. And it's possible because of all the advances and many of the advances that actually come out of the work that was done here. And so we're going to have, and in China, for example, starting next year, their plan is to sequence 50% of all newborns. Here we have some hospitals like Rady in San Diego that are wanting to sequence every child as quickly as possible who's admitted to the NICU. But in China, they have a goal of sequencing half of every newborn by next year and then moving toward everybody. And we will do that. We'll do that as well. So what's that going to mean? It means we're going to have billions of people And we're going to have in their electronic health records, we're going to have information about their genetics, their genotype, and information about how those genes are expressed over the course of their lives. And that's all the information in their electronic health records, their life records, some of their biometrics. And then, and it's very relevant here where you have the world's fastest supercomputer, then we will recognize, as we already do, that human beings are not an infinite data set. Our ancestors, who didn't understand science, would have, if they could have used this language, they would have said that humans are an infinite data set, because that was all the magic and mysticism of where humans came from. There wasn't an intellectual model for making sense of what a human is and how a human functions. But we are not, in my view, and I imagine most of you share this, we are not infinite data sets. We are just unbelievably massive data sets. And that's the difference that is going to allow us to use these billions of sets of data around real people, their genotypic and phenotypic information, to increasingly understand our complex systems biology, this ecosystem of ecosystems, but with genetics at its core. And that is very quickly going to allow us to increasingly unlock the really complex secrets of systems biology and of complex human genetics. So right now we understand simple human genetics, even in a clinical context, pretty well. And that's why for testing and even when you send in your 23andMe samples, you can get information about your single gene mutation disorders and whether you have carrier status for single gene mutation diseases like sickle cell or Huntington's or Tay-Sachs. But our understanding of complex genetics, and most of our diseases, disorders, and traits are not single gene mutation on-off switch. They are very, very complex. But our understanding of complex genetics is increasing very rapidly. Many of you maybe have heard of this concept of polygenic scoring, but it's a way of using mathematical models to understand diseases and disorders and traits that could be influenced by tens, hundreds, or thousands of genes, and which are in fact different with all of us. So it's not, I mean, this is a very complex process of decoding, but it's just massively complex. It's not infinitely complex. So we're going to have this knowledge, and it's going to fundamentally transform the way that we do healthcare. Because right now, what we call healthcare is really sick care. You have a symptom, you show up at your doctor's office, you describe your symptom, and the doctor tries to go backwards to treat that symptom. But maybe you had that symptom, maybe something was growing inside of you for 10 years. Or maybe it's a genetic disorder that could have been identified a few days after conception. So now it's like you're 40 and you're going into your doctor's office, and let's just say, maybe I won't make it you, somebody goes into their doctor's office and let's just say they're diagnosed with early onset familial Alzheimer's. Well, that was knowable 40 years ago. It just wasn't known. So when in this world of precision medicine, we are very quickly going to transition into a world of predictive health. And our model of healthcare is going to shift from treating symptoms to understanding probabilistic risks and thinking about models for how to prevent. And that is scary for people, because if you're in the hospital and you have your doctor hands you your newborn and says, hey, congratulations, and just FYI, your kid has a 70% greater than average chance of getting early onset familial Alzheimer's 40 years from now. Now you say, this is the happiest day of my life. How can you scar this? You've ruined my day, and what am I supposed to do about it? And I get it, because that's the world that we live in. But imagine, not you, somebody else has a daughter. And that daughter, whoever forbid, develops breast cancer. And in the treatment, you say, well, this daughter has a genetic, either a single mutation or a pattern that had always given her a predisposition, a far greater than average predisposition for breast cancer. And you say, hold on a second. So my daughter is now 40, and she just had, because that's that standard protocol, she just had her first breast cancer screening. And why weren't we screening her when she was 20? You doctor, you had this information. Why didn't you give it to me? And there will be no answer to that. As a matter of fact, it will be malpractice to not give that. So we are going to demand this information for very, very good reason. Like waiting until you have a symptom is the dumbest way to do healthcare. And having everybody freak out because they have a 20% greater than average risk of having 50 different diseases also could lead to chaos. So we're going to need to find some kind of balance between those two things. But we talked about the human genome. And we call it the human genome for some very good and obvious reasons. We don't call it the disease genome. We don't call it the healthcare genome. It's the human genome, because our genome isn't just saying, it's not just a collection of disease states and non-disease states. It's the blueprint for who and what we are. So this model of predictive health is very, very quickly going to transition into a model for predictive, not certainly predictive, but probabilistically predictive life. So the same doctor who's handing you your newborn talks about these disease risks and say, hey, just want to let you know, we've also done the analytics of your newborn's genome. And just FYI, your daughter has a 70% greater than average chance of being incredible at abstract math, or sprinting, or having a super outgoing personality, or a sunny disposition. All these things, I talked about fate, all these things that have felt to us like the mystery of life unfolding. We're going to have more information. This will never be, you only get certainty when you have these single gene mutation, these binary on-off switches. This is all in the world of complex probabilities, and there's also environmental factors that are critical. But we're going to have this information. How are we going to think about that? How are we going to think about parenting? How are we going to think about identity? That if somebody steps up on a stage like this and sings a song or does something, like your parents, if you're a little kid, say, wow, that was so brave of you. You really did that. But how will we think differently? It's like, oh, yeah, no, we knew you were going to do that because we had that information. And we laugh. And we laugh because it's just a different model of what it means to be a human. And that's where we are heading. And we're going to have to figure out, well, how do we deal with that? How do we integrate that information into our concept of ourselves, our children, our future? And it's a really, really big question. But the killer application, quote unquote killer application, of the genetics revolution is going to be how it transforms the way we make babies. I mean, that is the way that is what's going to superpower this technology, this science, and that's why it's going to begin to touch our evolutionary trajectory as a species. So right now, average person, average woman undergoing IVF has about 15 eggs extracted. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. And in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD, also sometimes PGS or PGT, different names, those eggs are fertilized. They're grown about 5 days. A few cells are extracted, and these are cells that would otherwise have grown into placenta. So that's what, and then those are sequenced. And so right now it's used to screen mostly for single gene mutation Mendelian disorders, as well as in starting to be for chromosomal abnormalities. But in the near future, as we unlock the secrets of the genome, as I've described, we're going to have all this other information about probabilistic disease risks, about potential capabilities. All of this information we are going to have. And so what's that going to mean if you're choosing from which of those 10 or 15 fertilized eggs to implant? And you have all of this information. Will you want it to guide you? Will you want to make an informed, a relatively informed decision about which of your all-natural pre-implanted embryos to implant in the mother? Some people will, and some people won't. And the people who do will have a lot more information. When you're starting with 15, your options are limited. I mean, there are places like here where it's legal to select based on gender. There are other places like India and China where it's not. So let's say you're starting with 15 and you say, well, I want a boy. Well, now you're down to maybe 8. And of those 8, maybe you say, well, I want to optimize health. I want lower risk of maybe deadly genetic diseases. So maybe that takes you down to 7 or to 6. And you see your options are limited. And those options are limited. I don't mean to be discriminatory, but it's not men's fault. Because average male ejaculation has about 1 billion sperm cells. So men are just giving it away. It's women. It's women who are stingy. So I said average number of eggs extracted in IVF is 15. That's the limiting factor. If women were producing eggs at the same rate that men are producing sperm cells, we could be procreating like salmon. And in animal models, that is becoming possible. You're all familiar with, I mean, it feels like magic of stem cells, particularly induced pluripotent stem cells, iPS cells. Shinya Yamanaka won the 2012 Nobel Prize for this. And so here's how you do it. You take any kind of adult cell, and skin cells or nucleated blood cells are the easiest targets. So you take a skin graft. Using the 4 Yamanaka factors, you induce those skin cells into stem cells into egg precursor cells into eggs. All right, millions of cells in a skin graft. So let's just say we call it 100,000. Now we have 100,000 of your natural, and I started by telling you what I mean by natural, which is we have no clue what natural is. But you have 100,000 of your eggs. Fertilize all of them with these virtually unlimited sperm. Now you have 100,000 fertilized eggs. And in an automated process, you grow them for about 5 days. You extract cells from each of them. You sequence them because the cost of sequencing is trending toward 0. And now, what does procreating look like? It looks like making a list of priorities. And so the first ones are probably pretty clear. Like, I want to have a kid who's not going to die of a terrible, deadly genetic disease. I think most people, not everybody, but most people would say, well, that's like a fair criteria. And then maybe people would say, well, I want to have a kid who has the greatest chance of living a long and healthy life, because we have all kinds of the superagers who are being sequenced, and we're beginning to identify the genetic underpinnings of these people who live these incredibly long and healthy lives. But then what? Then we are getting into these very, very personal traits. Things like genetic component of IQ, personality style, everything that has a genetic foundation, which is most things. We will be able to increasingly, never completely, increasingly understand the genetic component of those traits. And many of them will be both genetic and environmental, and be influenced by other parts of our system's biology, but we're going to increasingly understand them and increasingly be able to select for them. And then on top of that, then we will be able to do what we humans, even though it is extremely unethical, are already doing, which is using precision gene editing tools like CRISPR. And again, CRISPR, George Church, who I do at Harvard, who I do a lot of speaking alongside, he calls CRISPR genetic vandalism, because he just thinks like doing a double-stranded cut is way too aggressive. But now there's base editing. There's this new tool, Leaper, that was just announced last week. I mean, there will be many, many, many more iterations of precision gene editing that will become more precise, faster, cheaper. So then we're going to be able to in these pre-implanted embryos, maybe selected from among 10,000, among 100,000, go in and make a small number of gene edits. I debate this with George. He thinks we're going to go in and make 12,000 edits to a pre-implanted human embryo. I don't think we're going to be able to do that just because of the complexity of biology. But I do think that we will identify a small and discrete number of targets where we will be able to either eliminate an outsized risk or provide some kind of outsized benefits. And a lot of people say, well, I get it, I'm for therapeutic applications of genetic technologies, I'm against enhancement, but there's no way to draw a line between those two. There's just no way, and people trying to do it are going to get stuck because we all, like, what is normal? Like, there's so many variants, and what's normal to one person is abnormal, and so we're never going to be able to say, all right, this is therapy and this is enhancement. So everybody who says that, I mean, it's hard because it's so clean. It's so clean for people to say, well, I want to use genetic technologies to fight and prevent disease, deadly heritable disease, but not for enhancement. It's not achievable, in my view. And that is going to really, again, push us toward thinking differently about the malleability of biology and our role as actors driving that change. I mean, that is incredible. I mean, just for our whole history as a species, we have, whatever your theology, experienced, imagined, created, you insert the word, our gods. And our gods had attributes. And among these attributes were the ability to remake life. And now, to quote Stuart Brand, we are as gods, so we better start getting good at it, because that is where we are heading. And all this technology, like, we'd like to think that there's this enlightened, objective world of science. And you all represent as close to that as we have. And then there's the irrational rest of the world and society that's less data-driven, less objective. And in some ways, that's true. But our science exists in the context of us. Like, it's impossible to entirely separate science and the context of that science. And so this science is growing, is in some ways being unleashed in a world characterized by us. And who are we? One, we're extremely diverse. We have within our societies, between our societies, we have different attitudes, different senses of what is an appropriate role for humans to play in meddling with nature. What is the role we can or should or maybe must play in, quote unquote, playing God? And so we are seeing those divisions play out now within our societies in, for example, the abortion debate. And we're seeing it internationally, where there just are many different communities, including many different countries, that think very, very differently about this science and how it might or even should be applied. And that's why we have different regulatory structures in all of the different countries. And certainly China, this book, Hacking Darwin, was already in production when the birth of those first 2 Chinese CRISPR babies was announced last year. And I called my publisher. I got good news and bad news. The bad news is we need to pull the book out of production because I need to make some changes. The good news is in the book, I say this is coming, it's imminent, and it's going to happen first in China, and here's why. And I just need to add a sentence. On this day, it was announced that it did happen. It was always going to happen. The first gene-edited babies, in my view, were always going to be in China for complex regulatory and political and cultural and other reasons. So we are all different. And we live in a world characterized by competition. And I was getting a briefing by your colleagues this morning, and they were saying that in the 50s and the 60s, the people at Los Alamos, when this idea of this lab being created to create a healthy competition among the labs, the people in Los Alamos were saying, The Soviets are healthy competition, but those effers at Lawrence Livermore, those are the enemy. And so we live in this, that's what we do. Like, we find competitors, we find enemies in the most benign places imaginable. I mean, little kids on the playground, everyone's saying, like, that guy's trying to screw me. And that's how we do it. And so people are competing against each other within societies, and we saw that with this college admission scandal. And this is just a pure aside. The entire U.S. University system, probably with the exception of MIT, Anantha's alma mater, is totally corrupt. It just is. So my critique of these people who were paying off the soccer coach at Yale and Stanford is it's like you're both corrupt and stupid. Like, why would you pay $5 million to the soccer coach and be part of a scandal when you could just make a $5 million contribution for a building and your kid will be ushered in to Stanford? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But we are competitive. And I have a friend of mine who's in Korea. He has 12 tutors a week coming for his 11-year-old to his house to help his 11-year-old daughter. And in Korea, they have a national law that the cram schools, these private cram schools that help people prepare for their college entrance exams, have to close at 10 p.m. because people were having their 7, 8-year-old kids stay out past midnight 7 nights a week preparing for exams they were going to take in a decade. And when I told him, I said, with this technology, you can select, you will be able to rank order your pre-implanted embryos from highest to lowest IQ. And let's say you're starting with 15. That accounts for about 15, on average, estimated about 15 IQ points, being your highest IQ option of your 15 pre-implanted embryo and your lowest. What does 15 IQ points translate into? I mean, I know I'm getting in trouble here, but my guess is subtract 15 IQ points from anybody in this room, you probably would not be here. It just is. It just is. That's the way our society is sorting people based on certain attributes. And we can pretend that those attributes don't, in most cases, have a biological foundation, but we'll be, in my view, lying to ourselves. We are genetic beings, and that's the whole point, is we're looking under the hood of our very humanity. And so this is a really big deal that we're competing on an individual level and on a national level, because these technologies, this isn't just about a few things, about having smarter babies. This is the leading industry of this century. Whoever leads the biotech revolution is going to lead the world. I mean, it's not in the United States that we happen to win the Second World War. We happen to have Vannevar Bush. We happen, I know I mispronounced his first name because he pronounced it in some funny way. We happen to have the most successful economy in the second half of the 20th century, and we happen to be the guarantor of an international system that is modeled on our principles. All of those things are intimately connected. If we didn't have that, if we didn't have the world's leading economy, and that economy was based on the kind of work that you and your colleagues do, we wouldn't have been able to put our mark on the world. We wouldn't have been able to lay the foundation of the post-war international order. So what is at stake here, it's not just having different kinds of kids or better treatments for cancer. This is about multi-trillion-dollar businesses and global leadership forever. That's what's at stake here. And so the science is racing forward. Every day, there's another announcement of some kind of study that if that study had come out a decade ago, the person who wrote it would get a Nobel Prize. And now it's like nobody even notices. Like last year I was saying, hey, just who here knows that 2 male mice in a lab just had their own 100% genetically related baby mouse. Like, that seems like a big deal, and nobody knew. 10 years ago, if that had happened, that would have been like, for sure, a Nobel Prize. So every day, what would have been Nobel Prize-worthy discoveries are being released. So this is moving really, really quickly. And there's this mismatch because the science is advancing exponentially, our understanding of it is advancing linearly, and our regulatory environment is only inching forward glacially. So there's a mismatch that's really dangerous. And all of this raises, as you all can appreciate, just some incredibly deep, fundamental ethical issues. And what I always say is this: science is what brings us to this conversation, but ultimately this is a conversation about ethics, about values, about how are we going to use these powers that we increasingly will have wisely. And issues like, what does it mean to be messing with very complex systems that we don't remotely fully understand? What about issues of equity? Who has access to these technologies? And how do we avoid building a world with genetic haves and have-nots? H.G. Wells would have called them the Eloi and the Morlock. And that's one dystopian possible future. If we don't want that, we better start investing in another one. How do we think about diversity? Diversity is our sole survival strategy as a species from an evolutionary perspective. And if we all make choices that seem perfectly rational, even preventing terrible, deadly genetic diseases, we may be reducing the diversity and therefore the resilience of our species. So how do we think about diversity at a time, like for 4 billion years, diversity has just been baked into our biology. It just was. We didn't have to think about it. Now we're going to have to understand what we mean by diversity and how do we apply diversity, especially what does it mean if some individual is told, hey, you need to be a carrier of diversity. You need to be maybe a recessive carrier of some potentially fatal disease-related gene, because we don't know what threats we may face in the future. We saw a slide this morning that there are these people, that there could be some terrible deadly pathogen, and somebody somewhere has resistance. Especially if it's a novel pathogen, there's no way we could have known that that person would have had that resistance. So how do we think about that if everyone on a parental level is starting to choose based on what they see as optimization, but it's based within their cultural context? Because there's no good and bad in evolution. There's just being particularly suited for a given environment. And when that environment changes, you could have been the best suited white moth in the winter, but you're kind of screwed when the snow melts. Yes. And that is this principle that applies to everybody. And so we have this world, this future, it's coming at us so fast and we're not ready. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, why I'm speaking, why I love speaking to groups like you, why when things like Joe Rogan, and I was saying before, when we talk about Joe Rogan, all the young people, or most of the young people will know, oh, I know who that is. And all of the older people, myself included until recently, will say, well, who the hell is that? And so anyway, so if you're a young person, you probably know, but for the older people, meaning my age and older, which excludes Eric because he's 1 year younger than me, Joe Rogan is like bigger than Oprah in the podcasting world. Is that this change is coming, and it can't be. We can't do it like we did recombinant DNA, where the scientists understood what was happening, understood the stakes, met together at Asilomar, not so far from here, established guidelines for how the science could be used responsibly. The guidelines were by and large followed, which is why it's now totally safe to consume GMO crops. There are maybe other issues with GMO crops, which is why I'm totally against labeling, because my feeling is, what's the point if it's not dangerous? But people don't feel that it's safe. People feel that there's something wrong. People feel that this is an affront to quote-unquote nature. And one of the reasons is because this GM just happened to people. They weren't part of it. They weren't educated. They weren't invited to be part of a conversation about what's coming. It just happened. And then they had a gut reaction that most people have, like, hey, wait a second, this doesn't feel natural. I want to eat natural corn, not GM corn. And what percentage of people know that there's no such thing as quote unquote natural corn? Because 8,000 years ago, it was this little weed in today's Mexico with a few kernels on it. But that's not how people feel. So we need to be educated. We need to bring everybody, and that means the people in this room, and you guys are at the forefront of people who understand this, but also people who aren't in this room, people from the disability community, people who are disadvantaged in this country, people in other countries who are disadvantaged states, maybe illiterate people. This is about the future of our species, and everybody needs to be part of the conversation. And so that's with your responsibility and our responsibility is that everybody needs to understand this and understand what's at stake. And I've tried to write this book as a way of making it easy for people, but there are lots of other great resources. My friend Sid Mukherjee has a wonderful book that I highly recommend called The Gene. There's a lot of great stuff. We also need to engage our political leaders. And that's one of the things that we need to have a groundswell of public engagement so that we can have people saying to our political leaders, like, yeah, the Mueller testimony, it's captivating, kind of captivating TV. But we have some really big stuff that we have to figure out. And what are you doing? And that has to happen everywhere because there are some countries like the United Kingdom that have really smart, thoughtful regulatory infrastructures. The US, we have aspects of that. Like the FDA is a great agency, but it exists within the chaos of our piecemeal, haphazard healthcare system. And because this is a lot of the applications, the first applications are in healthcare, it creates this chaotic environment. Places like China, where there are decent laws on the books that aren't being enforced, and there's a Wild West culture. And then other countries where there's kind of nothing. And we've seen that with the stem cell tourism. People go to the Caribbean or Kazakhstan to get very dangerous, in many cases, treatments because that's where they can. And we don't want that. We're talking about the future of life. And it must be regulated, but it has to be regulated in a way that optimizes the good stuff and minimizes the harms. And so that is where we are. I mean, we are at this turning point for our healthcare and for our species. And we all have to find a way. And scientists like you are critical nodes in this process. We all have to find a way of educating ourselves together and bringing everybody else into this conversation that can allow us to develop standards and norms. And as Mike mentioned, I'm working with the World Health Organization in Geneva, but this is a much bigger thing than the WHO or the UN or really any of us, any country. To how do we build the kind of global norms that we've started to build in areas like chemical, bio, nuclear, even climate change? And how do we begin that kind of process? Because 10 years from now, this is going to be the most important issue for everybody. Everyone's going to realize, I mean, these two CRISPR babies have been born. The third one in China probably already been born. There's a Russian scientist who says he has 5 parents lined up. I mean, it's going to be 2, 3, 4. In 10 years, there will be thousands of gene-edited babies. And we better make sure that we have our values, our best values, woven in to our decision-making about science. I mean, that's what you all represent, is that yes, we have this kind of madness of a nuclear arms race and this whole crazy system. But you guys represent a set of values that we want to go along with that to make sure that we can optimize the protective capabilities of nuclear energy while minimizing the unbelievably horrible downsides. And that's what we need more of. So this whole talk, and the book, is my way of transferring part of this responsibility to you, to go out and spread this message in your worlds and engage people and bring people into this conversation about our future, because it's going to be a wild ride. Thank you.